All right. So welcome to the node.js Diagnostic Working Group meeting on 30th September 2020. To start with, are there any announcements? Take it as a no. So we go with the regular agenda. Basically, the items listed in the issue tracker with the diag agenda label put on them. And if we get some time, we could also touch base on the user journey deep dives, but usually Mary drives that. And in case if Mary is not coming by that time, we will see how much time we get for that and take a call there. So to start with the regular agenda, first in the list is 35286 proposal, mark asynchronous and async local storage as stable. This is opened by Stephen.
Yeah. Yes, I'm proposing at least async resource has been largely unchanged for a while now and is basically stable in all but name. And async local storage, I'm less sure about that being stable yet, but like as someone that's worked in APM for many years and used basically that feature in user lands, I'm fairly confident it does what it's supposed to. And just like it's being used in the Datadog agent right now and it works. It's like I'm fairly confident in it, but I can understand if people still feel that basic local storage is not quite ready yet. But I would like to suggest we try and get a timeline for when we would consider async local storage, like aim for node 16 or something maybe.
Yeah, I think defining a set of, this happened for some of the other features like NAPI and worker threads, like defining a set of exit criteria would be helpful. Like, for example, one of the ones we had for, I think both of them was like real world usage. And you just mentioned Datadog as like one of the things that would fulfill that, right? So I think having that checklist would help in, when the proposal comes, is like people look at it and say, oh yeah, okay, so it's being used for real in these two situations. It's met these other things. So
I just want to make sure we have like some actual like specific criteria of how do we get this out of experimental, because unfortunately diagnostics category has a few too many things that have been stuck in experimental forever. So I
think that one is just propose the criteria and hopefully we can work to, get agreement that is the criteria.
Do we have any specific objections to async resource being considered stable though?
I don't think there were any in the issue either, right?
Not that I saw, no.
Just exit criteria, which we define diagnose most reason want to exit experimental. So I'm unable to get the exact issue, but hopefully this comment might give some hints about what are the things which we discussed. Obviously, the actual criteria might differ from feature to feature, but I'm thinking that there could be some abstract, some general checklists that are common for all the experimental features. like having regular test coverage, not not the, I mean, absence of any non-major bug, things like that.
Yeah, I think the worker threads one had a decent list like that. I'm just seeing if it pops up easily.
Yeah, if you've got a good reference, I can take some time to go look through async resource myself and make sure it has everything it needs.
Okay.
As far as I know, it has like, proper tests and documentation and all that stuff, and like it is being used in user land in some places. Unfortunately, not as many places as it should be, just because it's still considered experimental, so some people aren't adopting it.
Yeah, it's the chicken and the egg, right? So I think that's kind of the combination of like, you could propose these exit criteria and then like, yeah, I think it's figuring enough usage, but yeah, it's not going to be as much as we'd like most of the time because it is a blocker. So
Yeah, I think I'm not an expert in this particular feature, but from my generic understanding, if at all there are concerns or questions, it won't be in terms of the capability or functional functionality as such, but there could be in terms of performance. I don't know how much we bridge the gap in terms of performance. I mean, using the async resource and async local storage, how much performance it brings to the table, and is it acceptable for production scale deployments?
So async resource triggers all on the JavaScript side, so it's actually faster than a lot of the rest of async hooks, just because it has to cross the native to JavaScript barrier. So I'm not worried about performance of it.
Okay.
that may just be like even if things have already been accomplished, like it may be, because I know you did some work around performance, right? So you might want to put into the exit checklist something that says, reach this level of performance, and then it's a place to where you can say, oh, and yeah, you've already done the work. It performs as well or better than all of the existing, ecosystem type alternatives. Just so that when people come to see, it's like that's just another data point that they don't ask that question versus already having the answer.
Well, actually, there are no user space replacements for this.
But I guess, there were equivalents, weren't there, like in the CLS module, like maybe not direct replacements, but ones that were being used to do similar.
I'm not aware that we had something like async resource in userland.
Yeah, not async resource. I think I was talking about async local storage.
Okay, async local storage, there are some, yeah.
Right. I think async resource, it sounds like there was basically consensus. Sorry, go ahead.
There are rough equivalents to async resource in userland, but nothing that like actually interacts with async hooks. It's like the same thing for something else. It's like CLS has its own way to wrap things, but then you're stuck with CLS. And there's like other like alternatives to CLS that have the same sort of thing. But I don't think that's a super fair comparison, just because of like how differently the underlying system works that those are attached to.
But it seemed like from the discussion, nobody really had concern over the async resource part. So if that can land, and then there's like the exit criteria set for async local storage, that's probably the path that will get us to the right end.
I do have.
Local
Okay.
storage, we have for sure the problem is NRP, because the NRP API still uses the this point as resource instead using the correct async resource.
Right. Is it just in that one, like that, there's one PR that Legendicast had on in flight? Is it just that
Yeah.
that needs to land, or is it something more than that?
I think this needs to land, yeah, to fix this. And
Right. So,
I don't know the actual state, so because between the time when it was created and now quite some changes were done in this area, like this performance improvements by Stephen and so on. But this is for sure one of the open topics. And I
Right,
think
so
we should fix this, otherwise it's more or less impossible for native add-ons to do it correct.
right. So that should be on the exit criteria list that or equivalent has landed.
And
Bradley, you had a point?
yeah, so I've raised an objection to some subset of the async local storage API designs. So I came to this meeting because I was told to. Basically, with enter with, the kind of bleeding through call frames is something that I personally understand the desire to have a functionality similar to that, but it doesn't have clear boundaries in its API contract. And so I just am not comfortable moving that out anytime without a clear boundary set or some sort of vast limiting condition that allows you to prevent some bugs like I showed in the issue thread. Yeah, that's all.
That's the limiting condition of like when it stops is specifically bound to the async resource stack in core, which is exposed through execution async resource, and also correlates directly to the after event in async hooks.
I guess so, but the problem that I stated and showed with some code examples in that issue thread are about exiting the call frame in which you are performing enter with and potentially bleeding into multiple logical async, whatever you want to call them, tasks. So
yes, it's not bound to the call frame; it's bound to the tech. So it's the before to the after, like between the before and the after of async hooks. It'll capture everything within that, which could be like a whole bunch of like, stuff that may or may not connect directly. So you'd get exactly the same behavior if you, like, for example, enabled async hooks inside an events emitter like handler, and then like the next handler would have like async activity that appears in that async hooks instance until you go and disable it at some point. So it's pretty much the same as what we already have for async hooks.
I'm not stating that it is significantly different from what we already have. I'm just showing bugs that I am uncomfortable with in that issue thread. The response where those aren't bugs, and it seems to be the same response here, when I hear that, it makes me much less comfortable and much more wary that we should ever ship it, because I'm trying to show code examples with conditions that would be problematic, that do have stale references and things like that, and being told that the stale references are intended is worrisome. But that's not a problem with some of the other APIs.
Yeah, and I guess we're not talking about, async hooks are experimental as well. So being the same as them doesn't mean that it's good to go to non-experimental.
But I do not agree that the other APIs are different. Because if I go to your examples where you have 2 listeners on an event emitter, so the way how it is done now in several places is to just monkey patch event emitter, emit function, and then use the run in the end around the emit, which means you cover all the emitted events, which exactly leaks the same what you say. So it is in the end not leaking. It just means as an APM tool, you want to monitor every emitted event.
So the problem with
if
interwith is it doesn't behave like that.
Pardon?
Interwith exceeds that timeline. So it goes beyond what wrapping emit does. After emit finishes, it continues until the end of the tick. So it doesn't behave like an APM.
It just means you need to go one step further. So if you go down into node core somewhere in the beginning of, let's say, an incoming web request, and then you call the run there, then everything beyond this processing this incoming web request will be on this tick, and it belongs to this single resource. And this one we would like to monitor. And one way is to call this enter with in the beginning of this, or you wrap it via a run. And this wrapping should happen in the very, very beginning of this tick. So somewhere really down to node core, which is not easy to reach, but and also not really part of node core in the end. But node core should give hooks to allow someone to do this. And this is what was the intention here.
I'm not arguing that intention, but I'm stating that the API contract is very different with interwith from what you're describing. Interwith is susceptible to things like prepend listener, breaking that guarantee that you're trying to state. It must happen at the beginning. And if somebody does something such as prepend listener, that guarantee is broken. It also, unlike what you're describing, is not a wrapper entirely. So you can have things where if you perform interwith multiple times on the same tick, you can get stale storage values. And so this has been covered a bit in the issue thread. If you were to propose something where you did expose those hooks that did actually wrap a full operation, I would not have any objections.
Yes, the actual intent of interwith is to be used in combination with diagnostic channel, which in the case of an HTTP server emits an event before the request event is emitted. So the prepend event listener doesn't really matter at all for that use case.
So there's no guarantee that interwith only happens in concert with diagnostics channel. That could be an alternative where we only emit diagnostic channels events, and then we have some kind of hook that is performed there. That would, I think, always ensure that it only happens once per tick, and it would happen at the beginning.
There's not really any way to do that automatically though, because we don't know what stores want that to happen on them, and we don't know what channels that they want that data from, or what specific event on that channel. There's just not really any reasonable way to do that.
Then how are they supposed to be used in concert with diagnostic channels if diagnostic channels don't provide enough information?
The user of the diagnostic channel has to specify in their own code, they have to listen to whatever specific named channel they want to be the starting point of their trace transaction, whatever you want to call it, and they have to look at inspect the message and decide at that point, should I call this enter with, and what should I call this, like what object should I use to call enter with to set as the context.
So why can't this be integrated against that existing amount of data that we have?
Because we don't have that data. The user of the API has that data.
So the user of the API has the data. What is the problem with requiring the user to provide the data?
It's not like a strict match of like, here, just match to this. It's like they have to like look at the events, make their own decision about like whatever is in the structure of this event. Like they might want to grab like the URL out of a request and decide I want to match against this, or they might only care about the method, or they might want to match everything, or they might want like a completely different point in the request lifecycle to start their transaction. They might want like earlier, like before it does any like TLS handshaking or things like that.
I'm not arguing against any of that. The question, I guess I'll try to rephrase. If we have the diagnostics channels events and the ability to choose, such as running a function, against the data in the diagnostics channels events, and such a diagnostic channel event is ensured to wrap a full tick effectively, maybe not by implementation. Why can't they run a function off the parameters of the diagnostic channel? The whole problem with interwith is there aren't actual API guarantees about the scope in which it runs, which is how you get into odd situations like that issue thread. Alternatives, you could try to just limit kind of the possibility of those problematic situations, such as throwing if you've already called interwith on the same tick. That would definitely prevent at least one of the odd situations. It doesn't add to the API any sort of guarantee about timing, that it's appropriately timed, but at least you would avoid some stale references.
I'm not really sure exactly what you mean here by like stale references, though.
So in the issue thread, I had a function called unrelated timer. I think it was unrelated set timeout, where if you have a tick and it's doing multiple processing of some kind, say it's a batch operation, you may have multiple asynchronous tasks being processed on the same tick. So you could, for example, potentially emit multiple request events. This current API with interwith has some issues with that design. That is really it. You can get into situations where you get a storage value of the previous request, and that is what I'm calling the stale references. And so there's a code example about issue thread.
If there's multiple events being emitted on the same tick, then we want them to be related. We want to capture all of those.
Exactly. So the wanted references, not the stale references. This is exactly what the feature should do and not what it should not do.
So
consider, let's say we have an incoming web request, and in the context of this incoming web request, I trigger a timer and an outgoing web request and a database request. So one after each other. We want all of them get the context propagated.
You want
this is all part of the transaction.
The claim here is that you can produce code, such as I did in the issue thread, where you can have a set of events that are not inherently related to each other. They've just been batched somehow, potentially is a good example. And so if we have some pooling mechanism and it's batching up to be processed events of some kind, you can actually get into a case such as where you emit two requests. I'm not arguing about this being invalid. But when you get storage on the second request, you get the first request's information. And that is the issue. If that is not possible, I don't really have any complaints. But claiming that it is the intended result is very problematic and terrifying to me.
Is it related to
We're literally
timing?
setting storage on the second request, but getting the first request's value.
So if I understand, it's related to calling enter with more than once.
That is the easiest scenario to recreate, but I could probably recreate other scenarios.
Okay, so like in the case of enter with, I think I could kind of see that if you call that multiple times with different stores, based on when an event fires, you might get you're associated with the one you called it the first time with or the one you call it the second time with, right?
Correct.
Is that sort of that's the source of, you know, so you don't know which of the two you're going to get. You might get some with one and you might get some with the other one.
Yes, that is the only real issue. And the problem is just that Interwith doesn't have any sort of API guarantees that allow you to avoid this currently.
Right. So that's where, if I understand your suggestion of like, if you could only call it once, that would solve the problem, right?
It solves, I would say, more than 50% of realistic scenarios, but it breaks the ability for you to have batch requests.
Well, queuing and batching is in general a problem with async resource and async hooks at all. So the solution for queuing is in general to use async resource to identify the individual items.
Right. So I guess one question would be like, if enter with could only be called once, does that actually break use cases that people think need to be covered?
So if you call enter with and you're within an async resource, it scopes to only that async resource. So if you batched, like, say, requests together in the same tick, if you gave each request its own async resource, which arguably we should, enter with would scope to that request. And that's actually exactly what run already does, is it just creates a new async resource and runs enter with within it.
So I couldn't quite parse if that was a, you know, that means it's okay if you couldn't call enter with more than once on the same async local storage or not.
So I would argue we should be able to, specifically because there is like a use case for that in APM of switching whatever a current span is. Yeah.
So in .NET, for example, they have only a set, which is effectively the same as enter with. And I'm not aware that they have any problems with it. So at least with the colleagues I talked with from .NET area, they are fine with just setting it and then changing it and clearing it whenever they need to do. And whenever it's set at one point in time, it's propagated. And if it's changed, everything that happens afterwards is propagated, gets the new value propagated, and so on. And this is more or less the same as if we would have only the enter with in Node.js. And I, honestly speaking, don't understand why these two languages should be that different.
So to my knowledge, with async storage on the .NET side of things, it persists past the current tick. It is persisted across the whole call chain of your async task. So even in the next async task running, it'll still be set to that value. So it's a different API.
This is the same for async local storage. The async local storage propagates it to all the follow-up created.
So me reading and kind of playing around in the REPL, maybe I'm doing it wrong. I'm somewhat new to this API, is it didn't seem to propagate past the current tick once you enter with. Is it
That
stopped?
might be a problem because it says specifically like this transition will continue for the entire synchronous execution.
So maybe we have some problem with defining what is a tick here and so on.
If you just match .NET, there's enough experience that I would not object, but it doesn't, at least the docs and my playing around in the REPL do not seem to match.
Yeah, so it's likely you would be running into like async resource issues then, because like, what enter with does is it binds the context object you give to enter with to be the current context until the end of the sync tick, and any async hooks init events that occur within that time will also be bound to that. So when they're before and after, like between their before and after, like in descending ticks, that same context object will be bound again, and so it will flow through the whole async tree. If there's any point where that's broken, it would be like an async resource issue, which there's the known issue of like events, like event emitters don't actually have any async resource binding. So the handler of an async, the handler of an event emitter doesn't actually bind to anything. It just runs in whatever the current context is. So the point where an emit happens is where an event emitter handler is bound to, not the point where the on event is attached, which there's been different opinions about what that should look like, and there's the same argument about promises, that it's hard to define whether the context of a callback is where you called then or is it where you resolved. It's hard to say, and so as a result, there's not been any movement on wrapping event handlers in an async resource.
Bradley, if you're talking, you're on mute.
No, I'm not talking.
No. Okay, sorry.
Trying to think of how to move forward with the issue in some way that allows progress. We can take this off some other time.
It sounds like, you know, it's maybe just figuring out whether your test case falls into the issue that you know, Cord was just talking about, Stephen was just talking about, or it's exposing something else, right?
I think there was some explanation that simply we don't have a mechanism to enforce people to properly have that kind of queuing or batching, which is fine. But there's no way for them to know if they're doing something weird. So like if they can't do interwith multiple times, if they get a warning or something, they know that they're doing something weird, at least, and that they should probably, you know, go and look at some docs, because if you do interwith multiple times, that's pretty simple to do with using queuing or batching. But if the intent is to allow interwith multiple times, they will do so without any sort of mechanism to know that, hey, this is very abnormal and probably not what you wanted to do. But I can't see any reason why you would want to do interwith multiple times. There was claim that changing the existing span during a single tick was valuable, but that would mean that you don't know your actual full context that you're trying to provide based upon the initial diagnostics channel or event parameters. And so that's more stuff to think about. I think in general, I'm still very uncomfortable with the feature, but maybe it can be tweaked in some way that just kind of lessens the possibility or warns of the possibility of you getting into these situations. A lot of the write-up on the domains postmortem was basically around similar things. People were doing things improperly, and just us claiming that they were doing improperly didn't really stop them from doing it. And so context propagation implicit is something people want. It's something in general you need if you want a realistic instrumentation. But doing it in a way that has these kind of easy gotchas is what worries me. So I'll think on it.
I'm all for having like a big red warning sign on the docs saying like don't use this unless you really know what you're doing. Like the intent, like the intended like general consumer API of async local storage is absolutely the run method. Like almost everyone should use that. And enter with is like quite specifically just for APM vendors, and like we would have fairly strong understanding of exactly what the implications of are running that.
So I don't think it should be in docs, unfortunately. I think it has to be something in the runtime because people will play around with APIs and they will ship things. A lot of people learn about APIs by playing around in the REPL, and a lot of people, I mean, at least from the ES modules side of things and the policy side of things, they do try to do unintended workflows on purpose. So I don't think a warning is significant here. A docs.
Given the interest of time, since we have other items as well, how about this? If I understand correctly, the discussion is not around as a bug in the module or something, but it's more about how the API and the abstraction is designed and how the user experience is centered around this module or the feature. So probably it's worthwhile to churn a little bit more through the issue tracker itself, probably listing the problem exactly, and we all having a look at that, and then probably run through this meeting maybe once or twice, and then if required we can have a dedicated session on this discussion itself. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, and I think like adding it as one of the exit criteria to have work through concerns about enter with makes sense. Like if we're looking to put together that's concrete list, this should be on that list, right?
Yeah. If I remember correctly, some of the earlier modules which exited experimental also had similar concerns. I mean, with respect to bugs and capabilities, it was good, but when it comes to the user experience, the name of the API or the external manifestation of the API, was it right or wrong? There was always this debate. So it's a good discussion to have, because once these APIs are frozen, it's absolutely difficult to make changes in the stable state. So
yeah, a good example is I pasted into the minutes the link for the worker threads one, and one is like review the source code for compatibility with terminate. So that's an example of like, hey, there's a concern in one of the things. Let's make sure that it, we understand and are comfortable that it either is an issue or isn't, and that if it is, we've tweaked to address it.
Yeah. All right. So I guess we continue the discussion into 35286 and visit it next week as well. So the next one in the item is 34895, which is create diagnostics channel module. Stephen?
Yeah, so that's basically as done as I intend it to be right now. It's just sitting, waiting for more review. Have one approval on it. Technically two right now because James accidentally approved it and hasn't unapproved it or
Okay.
changes or anything. There's only one valid approval right now. But yeah, I've done some like squashing, rebasing. So there's now just like 4 commits. There's the initial commit, which is like the actual core API, which is the like part that I'm fairly sure about. And then I have like 2 additional commits, which are making a channel async iterable, which is just kind of like an idea I was playing with at the recommendation of someone else. And I'm not really sure of the value of that, so may or may not drop that if we get any comments on if that has any value or not. And then there's the span API as well, which I pulled out, which I do feel we need something solving like what that is trying to solve, which is correlating multiple events together. I'm open to other ideas if people have better ideas on what that API should look like. But yeah, roughly we need to be able to correlate events to produce like a span on the like APM agent, and like we want to be able to see like this like request end is related to this request start, things like that. Or like what more like easily recognizable is like if there's like an FS read file or something, you might have multiple FS read files in the same request. They could even be triggered in the same tick. So we need to be able to like more cleanly connect the points. Be able to say like that this callback was triggered from this FS read file, and this callback was triggered from this FS read file, which we don't really have if we just are emitting plain data. We need some sort of correlation ID between things.
Is that correlation across, I guess, events, async events effectively, right?
Basically, it's roughly comparable to like async hooks. You get the async ID matching between the init and the before,
Right.
which is basically what we need. But we don't really have any guarantees of the timing of diagnostic channel events, and they could happen somewhere in the middle, somewhere. So for example, if someone does an FS read file, there's going to be an open and a close in the middle of there, and we don't necessarily want diagnostic channel events emitted to be associated with the open and close. We want to be able to say like this is related to me doing some FS read file stuff. So I've passed along this ID somehow to say like, yeah, this message is related to this.
But why not just leave this up to the publisher so that, let's say I have a channel where I publish some data, that it's completely up to me that I add the correlation ID for my requests I publish data for. So instead of trying to have a central mechanism with a running number or whatever, because there may be, just consider you have some messaging system which emits diagnostics events. This messaging system may have already existing correlation IDs inside, like Visual C, trace context or whatever. And if you have something like this in place, why not using it?
Well, most of the use case for diagnostics channel is emitting events from core. and core does not really have any specific correlation ID for things. So like if we decide we want to wrap like FS read file or like DNS lookup or something like that, we don't currently have any external information to attach to an event to indicate that two of them are connected. So we need something to generate IDs at the very least.
Is there any link to this between what we were just talking about and the like the asynchronous execution, like, and emitting the ID that the current async context, would that potentially link together the right things?
I'm not sure if we can bind this or should. So maybe we can bind it in a lot of cases to some sort of async context, but there might be quite some cases where this does not match. And in general, I would say that the diagnostics data emitted and the async context propagation are two orthogonal things, and we should not mix them together just because there are cases where it is, and just because there are users like APMs which need both of them. Because if you have a use case where you're not interested in the async context propagation, but on diagnostics channel, you should not pay the bill for the other one.
Yeah, I was just thinking from it sounds like we would have to create something similar in terms of like, some shared context, which is going to be emitted across different types of calls, like between the FS read, the open and close. What is it that ties those two things together?
Well, I would say we do not need anything global here. So if you call FS read, and we know a read is an open, a start, an open, several reads, and a close. So this is how it's built internally. So the FS module has to know that this open belongs to this read. So this internal open belongs to this read. So there is something in place already within the FS module to track its operations.
Right, like that's the FD, right, or something. Okay.
It's the file descriptor, for example, or whatever. And if this is something which they don't want to give outside, they can always add some sort of running number into this object they have internally and use this running number to issue it together with the events. So
right.
It's not a global way to do it. It's per channel. So this means as a user, I have to correlate FS events in a different way than HTTP events, for example. But on the other hand, we do not need some sort of complicated implementation within core, which can avoid optimizations in some modules which have already an existing correlation ID in place and would use them and anyway publish it.
Yeah. So another example I would think, which I think FS is like less clear example just because like it's fairly self-contained API, so it's not too hard to control like where data is coming from there. But with, for example, the like HTTP API, we might want events that are like anytime someone does like the stream write on response, you might want to, I don't recommend actually doing this, but like you might in theory want to capture some information at just like arbitrary points in the request lifecycle. And like if you try to attach that to the like async call graph, like that's not gonna give you anything useful. You're gonna be like maybe in the middle of like some other callback or something completely unrelated. It just happens to call right on the response. So like you kind of need to be able to just like store this ID on the request and just be like, yeah, I'm gonna log an event. I'm gonna grab my ID now and stick it on that event.
Yeah, I'm convinced. Like I understand better now that like it really should. I think that's what Gerhard was suggesting. It should be something that whatever the channel is, the certain thing like FS or HTTP. If there's a correlation, there's already something that tracks that. So it should be driven from that as opposed to anything else.
Yeah, just need to define exactly like what that correlation system is, I think. I mean, but like was already said, it only needs to be unique per channel. So like, in theory, anyone could make their own correlation for each channel. But I think it would be helpful to have at least some sort of rough standard for core to use, even if it's not a public API. Just so we can like have some consistency when we listen to like, yeah, I want to capture the life cycle events of this request and be able to know which request is which.
Yeah, I think I like the idea of it being private first, so that if it is useful within core, then it can be proven out before there's external dependencies.
So in general, every publisher has to document the event it publishes. And at the same time, it can also specify how so that this event is part of a span, or let's name it span of a group of events, name it group of an events. And at this place, it can also say, I use this and that as correlation ID in my channel. At the moment, we have not any real example for spans. So we know that the use case is here. So this, I think, is a general agreement. But maybe we can just do it like this. We add some instrumentation later on, in, let's say, an HTTP client, HTTP server, and this acts then as example how this is documented and how this works. So we do not have to choose the same mechanism there. So we can do it, but we don't have to. But in any way, once we use that, so we publish diagnostics data in one of these models, we have to write the documentation for it and specify which event is part of a span and which event is not part of a span, and how to correlate the spans within this channel.
Yeah, so the main reason I created like a complete span API as opposed to just like some ID generating API initially was just because like from the user perspective, if there's not a clear API on how to do a thing, they might just not do the thing. So like if we don't provide a clear and obvious way for them to correlate events to each other, they might not think to do that at all. So like if we leave it up to them to like, you can make your own correlation ID if you want to, a lot of them are just not gonna think of doing that. And that's helpful information that we want them to do. So having some sort of indication that people should do this, I think helps. Just not sure what that indication is yet.
And through the data that the API, like that the channel lets you just generate, there must be some sort of ID for correlation, right?
Yeah, so the current proposal is specified by adding a new API, so a span API. So this is somehow the proposal. Look, there's an API for this use case, just use it. And the other way would be more like to don't have this API, but that documentation at the existing one to say, okay, if you have events which belong together, then add some sort of identifier and document it to make this clear in your documentation of the events. So this is in the end the same solution for the topic. One is implementation within core, and the other one is just document it, that users have to do it, and let it up to them how they are doing it.
But I guess you could go one, like what I haven't had enough time to really dive into what's there, but like what I was imagining was is that there were some fields that you had to provide along with your use case specific data, and that the correlation ID could be part of that. So, they would actually have to choose to like not provide an actual correlation ID, and it would be obvious from that perspective, as opposed to, documentation that, hey, you should do something like this and figure it out. It would be more like, here's a piece of data that when you like emit an event, you need to provide. And so it's obvious you should be doing something.
It's
But
always
not everything should be correlated to anything specific, though. So correlation ID should be an optional thing, but most of the time it should exist, I think.
Yeah, so there are for sure operations which just happen and have some data, and that's it. So then you don't need a correlation ID and something like this.
Right, but I guess so. But still, back to my, in the there's a call to emit something. There could be like an optional parameter, which is the correlation ID, right?
Yeah.
So it's actually
It's
baked into the APIs more strongly than, hey, you can provide whatever data you want. One of the things should be the correlation ID. It's more like, here is where you pass in that correlation ID if there is one.
It's always up to the publisher to decide which API they use. And so they decide what they want to group and if they want to group something. So even with the existing API, no one forces you to use the span API. You can issue every single event via the normal just emit or publish API. So it's still not enforcing anything. It just gives a good hint by the presence of this API that there's a value in doing it. So.
Right. Yeah, I guess I'm not quite expressing. I'm just like the intermediate step between having a completely separate API is like, it's, that there must be like, here, I want to publish this event, right? And if it's clear that, it's baked into publishing event that you have the option of providing a correlation ID, that will be more of a reminder than, hey, there's some other way you can do this if you need to, or to manage it within your own data.
Now that's possible. And one additional thing that the span API currently provides is also like specific start and end events, just to delineate the overall life cycle of these correlated things, which that would be helpful as well, just from APM's perspective, to be able to correlate that to a span which has its own life cycle. It's supposed to match that.
So there's always some risk with this start and end event, because if someone forgets about the end event, then you have a memory leak.
I mean, depends on how you consume it. Yeah, potentially.
Looks like you're on top of the hour. And what is the conclusion on this particular thing? The 3, 4, 8, 9, 5, what would be the one-liner conclusion? Should we continue reviewing the PR?
Pretty much just what it already says. Needs more reviews, and like in particular more discussion about the couple commits that I've pulled out, and I'm trying to gather more feedback on. Just the async iterable and the span API.
Okay. Thanks. All right, unless somebody has anything urgent to discuss, we should skip the other 3 items in the agenda and call it today.
Thanks.
Nope. Okay, so thanks for the discussion. Talk to you in 2 weeks' time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
But
Right.